Hi, this is Colin. So, why are we doing this show today? We're doing it partly because the last electoral cycle was a time of significant Native American political activism. But it's also the case that I didn't want this conversation to be confined to that, and I don't want this conversation to be confined to this one episode of the show. I do feel, you might have heard me say this before the news, that of all the American subgroups, I think the one whose stories are the least heard are, paradoxically, the same people who were the first here. And I think it's incredibly important that we start telling these stories, and they've been telling their stories for a long time. Maybe it's just important we start listening. Anyway, we'll be talking about a lot of different aspects of that. But yes, one of the linchpins will be the way in which in record numbers, Native Americans were elected to significant offices this year. So kind of our primal text for this is by Sarah Sinclair, our first guest here. Sarah Sinclair, an oral historian of the Cree Ojibwe descent. She is the editor of the Voice of Witness oral history collection, How We Go Home, Voices from Indigenous North America. She teaches in the oral history master's program at Columbia University. Welcome to our show, Sarah Sinclair.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Before we begin, I'd like to give you a compliment about your book that has nothing to do with its subject matter. I think it might be the best footnoted book I've seen in, decades. Like every time I came upon something that I didn't understand, the explanation was at the bottom of the page. I didn't have to go to the back of the book and try to figure out, and the explanations were really good. I was so grateful for that. I was also increasingly aware of all the things I don't know and need to have explained to me. So it was good that you were doing that. All right, so let's get that out of the way. So let's talk about this last electoral cycle. This is something that you've written about recently, too. There was, I think, a significant effort among organizers, one of whom you will meet at the end of this show, to make sure that Native American peoples registered, voted, and knew about candidates who represented them, candidates who, so to speak, looked like them. Say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, all of this, there was such a great turnout throughout Native American communities, nations, and states. And then this really came into the forefront of the national consciousness, actually due to a mishap that happened on CNN. CNN was reporting voter turnout more generally, and they had a graphic that ended up going viral in which they lumped Native Americans into a subcategory of voters that they called something else. And so this graphic ended up going viral on Indigenous Twitter, on Facebook. And, Native Americans are kind of known for their sense of humor. And we're quick to start laughing about, yet another instance of erasure. But at the same time, it was particularly ironic and particularly maddening, given just how significant turnout had been in this election cycle. The year saw a record 6 Native Americans elected to Congress. And they were especially crucial to the Democratic Party's success in flipping both Arizona and Wisconsin due to great efforts made there.
Yes. So, by the way, I'm looking at that screen grab right now. And so you've got this chart that has white, Latino, Black, Asian, and in between Black and Asian, something else, 6%.
Right,
so,
exactly.
So if there was, a mobilization that represented something bigger than what's been seen in the past, were there one or two key issues that represented the fulcrum for this political mobilization?
It's not an area that I'm expert on, and I'm looking forward to hearing from your guest later. I would imagine that healthcare, particularly on the Navajo Nation, was significant. I also think probably, I know that during the Obama tenure, there'd been a real increase in monies dedicated to infrastructure on Native American reservations. And I would imagine that would be something that would have been very significant in getting people back to the polls.
So I want to talk about the stories in your book, these oral histories in your book, some of which are just lacerating in terms of the just trauma that they describe, some of which I think are very hopeful. Maybe we should start by talking about one or two of the hopeful ones. Tell us a little bit about Ashley Hemmers.
Sure. Yeah. So this project actually started out as my master's thesis project. I came to Columbia University to study oral history. And I should clarify that I'm First Nations, which is why I say they when I'm referring to Native Americans. I'm from the other side of the border myself. I grew up in Toronto, but my Indigenous lineage is on my father's side. He is a Peguis Nation, which is Cree Ojibwe. So I came to the program with an interest in using oral history to amplify Indigenous stories because, as you pointed out in your introduction, there really isn't a lot of space and hasn't been a lot of space made for Indigenous people to tell their own stories. So I was very conscious of the need for that. I grew up in Toronto, attended pretty progressive schools there myself, and yet even in that environment, these stories just weren't there. So that was my intention. Ashley was someone that I interviewed towards my thesis work, and that project had a much more specific narrative arc, which united all of the interviews. That was interviewing Native Americans in particular at that point, no Canadians, who had grown up in reservation communities, left to attend elite academic institutions, and then moved home again to work for their nations. And Ashley is someone that I interviewed towards that. So she is from Fort Mojave, which is a small nation which overlaps Arizona, California, and Nevada. And she really narrates a story of growing up in a community that had really suffered from the intergenerational trauma that is unfortunately, very widespread throughout North America. But she is a very bright young person who's really intensely supported by her mother and her grandmother, really raised with the culture and a lot of pride about who she is. And she pursues education, ultimately ends up at Yale, and then moves back to work for her nation, and is now tribal administrator there. And she, along with the team of people that she works with now, have really turned things around in many significant ways. One really important one to mention, that now they have created new businesses on the tribe to the extent that they can fully fund any member who wants to go and pursue an education, as Ashley did.
Yeah, I mean, and to do justice to the story, I think you kind of have to read it. It actually reminded me almost of a Native American version of Tara Westover's book, An Education or Educated. I forget what it's called. But the degree to which what she does is such an anomaly. I mean, there is just nobody around her that she could look at that would even give her the sense of the first step that leads up a staircase to Yale. And there's this kind of hair-raising story about, they just scraped together enough money for the flight out there, and so she can have like $100 in her pocket, and they're going there, and she has this indomitable grandmother. Maybe you could just quickly talk about the rain that they go through on the way to the airport.
Sure. Yeah. It's a really, Ashley's an amazing storyteller, and she narrates the day that she leaves Fort Mojave to go to Yale, and she's describing, she lives in the desert, but when the rain comes, the rain really, really comes. And her grandmother and her mother set out in what's a pretty beat up old car. The brakes aren't working, the rain is coming, the roads are flooding, and Ashley's thinking, maybe this isn't the day, maybe we need to turn back. And her grandmother says, no, we've started. We can't turn around now. If we turn around now, you might not do it. We've got to do it. And they get her to the airport. And once they get to the airport, Ashley's telling her mom and her grandmother, don't worry about me. I'm going to be fine. I hear there's free food there. There's free food at events. And as you said, she left with $100 in her pocket, and then arrived and had to, get a cab to campus and had to tip the driver. And, by the time she's settled in her dorm room, that little bit of money that she had is greatly diminished. But she does find, she talks about how she attends lots and lots of events and talks, and she gets really interested for a stretch in people who talk about maps because, she's just led in all kinds of different directions, both to learn, but also to eat.
Yes, I mean that's first of all, I should say that I attended the same fine institution
Hmm.
that she did, although of course I did in the late 1800s. But just the idea, she comes from significant poverty, where
Hmm.
the whole question of what's going to be on the stove on any given night is a pretty
Yeah.
open one and a pretty pressing one. And so this idea that you can walk into these beautiful dining halls at Yale and just sit down and, well, first of all, go through a line, get whatever you want and as much of it as you want, and that just sort of baked into your experience there. I mean, I have to say, I never thought about it that way in the 4 years that I was there. I mean, I was glad to have food, but I didn't think about it that way. And so many
Sure.
aspects of the story just kind of opened my eyes that way. Maybe particularly because of your unique position, it might be worth mentioning that. Okay, so I didn't go in the late 1800s, but I did go in the 1970s. I went. I
Uh-huh.
was there from 72 to 76. I don't remember anything about Native Americans at Yale. I don't remember any. I mean, maybe there were courses,
Yeah.
maybe there was a center. I don't think so, though. I don't think was anything like that. And so,
It
even
sounds
though
like, yeah.
yeah, even though Ashley's story reveals some real flaws there, and deans who think that they know her story because they're Italian American and they look Native American or something. At least it seems as though, whether we're talking about Columbia or Yale or wherever, there is an understanding that this is something that has to be featured and taught and made part of the institution. Maybe you could say more about that.
Yeah, I think there's an increasing understanding. I don't think it's perfect yet. I think there's been a lot of, I mean, starting with probably tracing it back to the 1970s when, Native American cultural and religious practices, which had been criminalized, were decriminalized, that allowed communities to start to recover culture and language that had been so suppressed. And it started a new trend, I think, of Native American activism in particular. And so Native Americans started to advocate for more inclusion, for greater representation at these institutions. And yeah, I mean, one of the things that really struck me about, speaking about Ashley in particular, she tells this story, that when she was a young person, there was a period of time where she became really interested in the Holocaust. Because reading about the Holocaust, she was better able to understand the intergenerational trauma that she saw in her own community. And she was born in the 80s. So even at that time, which is probably around 2000, there weren't texts available to her in her own community that described those conditions in Indigenous terms. So that really was one of the great motivators for me in creating what I hope is a really accessible book, because I wanted to provide for Indigenous people, for Indigenous young people, more of that representation and accessibility. And then for a mainstream reader, hopefully more of that context in terms of the history to better understand, some of the issues that exist within Native American communities today.
Right. You did make a very accessible book. You've written a very accessible book, and it really is it's thrilling at times to read these
Thank you.
stories. Sometimes in a good way, and sometimes in a really really bad way. But both
Yeah.
ways. And yeah, we're going to go to a break, or I'm going to get in trouble with Betsy Kaplan. But but I do want to say that whole idea of the extirpation of culture, the criminalizing of music, dancing, ceremony, ritual.
Mhm.
It is such a consistent feature of colonialism. One thing I learned about last
Mhm.
year is that steel drums in places like Trinidad and Tobago are kind of the result of the colonial governance banning the native drums, the drums that they had used for their music. And they
Mm.
eventually kind of began to make music on other things that were available. I think that if you want to subjugate a people, one of the first things you want to do is strip away the culture that they've had for
Mhm.
hundreds and maybe thousands of years. All right, let's take a break, and we're going to meet one of the people who is featured in this excellent book right after said break.
This is our time. Got me bringing up the heat from the east. That deep, wake up if you sleep. Wearing marks on my feet like cousin. Did you eat corn beans and squash? But don't forget none. From the father and the mom, born a daughter and a son. Two spirits out of one. We evolved, you just begun. Life's golden. Get some.
All right, we are back. This show is going to fly by too quickly, I can already tell. We're talking to Sarah Sinclair, an oral historian and the author or the collector, I guess, of the oral histories in a collection called How We Go Home, Voices from Indigenous North America. It includes both the U.S. And the First Nations stories from Canada. And we're now going to be joined by one of the people who does appear in that book. It's a pretty, it's a unique story. All of them are. So joining us now is Zubin Ornelas, who is ijua Apache. I hope I'm saying all that correctly. He worked at the New York City Ballet and as a substance abuse counselor. Zubin, welcome to our conversation.
Hi, thank you for Colin for welcoming me. I'm coming to you from Lenape land. I'm in New York City.
Yeah, I know that.
Just wanted to acknowledge, do a land acknowledgement there. I particularly enjoyed your introduction to the show. It was very well thought out, and you had questions. The way that you presented it, it showed that you had a genuine interest in what's going on. Also listening to Sarah, I'm just waiting for the day when MSNBC has Sarah on as a regular panelist discussing everyday issues of Native Americans and actually what's happening in our country. I can see Sarah doing that.
I can too. I like that idea. So one of the things that I was struck by at the beginning of your story is a description of growing up in South Central LA in the kind of the Watts area, where there are these already kind of burgeoning movements towards Black pride and towards the organization by people like Cesar Chavez of Mexican and Mexican American workers, but that the message you really got was to stay hidden, that rather than having some kind of a burgeoning moment of pride, it was hopefully nobody will even notice that we're here. Can you say more about that?
Well, actually, I can say more about that. When you talk about intergenerational trauma, I learned about intergenerational trauma from Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. And she had learned about it also through studying the Holocaust. But what I discovered was, looking back, I can see how intergenerational trauma affected Native Americans differently in different areas. And in urban areas, it's a different situation because we don't have a place where we meet or we see each other on a regular basis. So I'm speaking about more or less an urban area experience. So when you're sort of put down, and what happens is you get the original put down is when they take your kids away, when they send you to schools, when they try to actually basically destroy the roles of men in the society, that passes on. And ultimately, little is taught about our traditions and our belief systems. So what happens is we don't have anything to hang on to. We have to try to kind of find it ourselves as we go on. But if you're so beat down and you don't think and you don't have anywhere to look for it, and especially in a dangerous area where I lived, you wind up hiding.
Right. In your story, you talk about discovering alcohol at a very young age. You also just, after a career of doing kind of stage work in the world of dance, which you came to love, also developing injuries that led to Percocet, which led to addiction. And in the sense that I just want to build on what you were just saying, Zubin, is that those are things that you turn to when you don't know how to find the normal healing channels of your culture. That if nobody tells you that there's something like the Sundance, if nobody tells you what your people have been doing for hundreds and thousands of years, you wind up turning to these bad solutions. Maybe you can say more about that too.
Well, what it is, you're overwhelmed. Your feelings are overwhelmed. You're overwhelmed with depression. So you find anything to ease that. And alcohol will numb that for you. Alcohol will numb that feeling. And so you don't care what happens. It doesn't matter what you do. and you wind up putting yourself in much more dangerous situations when you're on alcohol. But the fact that it's a numbing experience, alcohol can be considered a medicine. It works.
Mm-hmm.
If you drink 1 or 2 drinks of alcohol and you have stress, it's going to go away.
Yeah.
The problem is that if you're an alcoholic, you think more is better.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Rather than, taking 1 Percocet every 4 hours, 4 Percocets every hour.
So what saved you? What turned your life around? Was it one thing? Was it 2 things? I know there was a person, there was love involved, but I think also culture was involved.
Well, what really happened to me was when you're drinking alcohol, what you're trying to do is become isolated. You're trying to be self-sufficient. All you want is the alcohol. And what you need is the opposite of that. You need people, you need relationships. And I was at a point in my alcoholism where I was going to die. I was on my deathbed, and I knew it. And I decided I didn't want to die. And even if I were to die, my concern was if I die and I die in my apartment, I'm going to be embarrassed because they're going to have to break the doors down because the apartment smells so bad because I'm in there rotting. That's how an alcoholic thinks.
Mm-hmm.
And at that moment, I decided that I wanted to live. And I called my doctor and said, could you get me into detox? Could you help me? And he said, yes. And then the following morning when I woke up, I thought, well, maybe I overreacted. Mm-hmm. But the seed had been planted, and I went to and I detoxed. I just did it, and it happened. And alcoholism, you wind up, it affects your mind as much as it does your body. So I was paranoid. I presented with mental illness when I came out, but the seed had been planted, so I wasn't going to give up. So the therapist sent me to an AA meeting, and I went to that AA meeting. I went to, 298 meetings in 90 days. And slowly I started to, people thought I had a mental illness because when you go in there, that's how you appear. And within the 90 days, you start to clear up a little bit. And I started to come alive, and I decided that I cared. And going from not caring to caring was the miracle that happened, was the thing that changed everything for me.
All right, so I'm thinking, just in the interest of time, first of all, people should be reading this book and should be reading Zubin's entire story here because, like so many of the narratives in this book, it's an incredible story. Sarah, I wanted you to have some time to respond a little bit. Before we went on the air, Sarah, Zubin and I were quickly talking about the fact that another thing that's happening right now is that there's an effort to restore the Olympic medals of Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe in 1912 was demonstrably the greatest athlete in the world and lost his medals over something that is not even a rule anymore, that he made a few dollars playing baseball at some point. But another thing about Jim Thorpe is also there in your book. He went to a place, it was called the Carlisle Industrial Indian School, and they had that philosophy that you mentioned in the book, Sarah, which is often expressed as, I think, kill the Indian, free the man. That there was an educational system that existed to pull Native American children out of their homes, put them in different surroundings, put them in residential schools, and basically just beat the culture right out of them. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that, Sarah.
Sure. Yeah. Kill the Indian, save the man. Both in Canada, we call them the Indian residential schools. Here, they were the Indian boarding schools. And it's very, very uncommon to meet someone of my generation, I'm 42, who doesn't have a grandparent or a parent who attended one of these schools. It is a hugely widespread experience shared by Native North American peoples. And as you said, the philosophy, this was a government enacted and sometimes church in Canada, also facilitated by the churches, but a policy that was designed to break up the Native North American family. And the idea was, if you attack the culture, if you disrupt transmission of the culture and the language, then you break up the family. And ultimately that sort of detaches the link to the land. Because obviously the project of both the American and the Canadian governments was to move Native Americans, First Nations peoples off the land to expand the settler state. And so the residential schools were part of that larger project to access land. And the repercussions are enormous. The intergenerational legacy was just kind of explored in this huge Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. It was a 5-year-long, essentially oral history project, which traveled Canada, had huge commissions. Tens of thousands of survivors came and spoke and shared their testimonies and their experiences, spoke of the trauma and the abuse that they suffered at the schools. And one of the things that many of my narrators speak about in the book, whether they had gone to these schools themselves or whether they were raised by people who had gone to these schools, is that it's had a hugely detrimental effect on Native American families because, imagine you're 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years old, you're removed from your own family, your own community, you attend an institution in which you're taught that everything that you knew was wrong, your language is wrong, your culture is wrong, you're shamed, and then you're released, when you age out of it. And then you have your own children. You don't have the skills required to parent. You haven't learned how to love. You haven't received love. And one of my narrators, Geraldine Manson in particular, talks about how, she was very lucky to have a real role model and loving figure in her mother-in-law, and that her mother-in-law really made it a project to help Geraldine learn how to love again so that she could raise her children with love. But then you have another narrator, Irvin Chartrand, who speaks about really not understanding the way that he was growing up, not understanding why his mother was drinking, seeing her as only an alcoholic, not understanding that what was going on with her was the trauma of the experiences that she had at that school until he was grown himself. And then he learned more about what had happened to her and understood his own life, his own childhood in this larger historical and sociological context.
Okay, I'm supposed to end the segment here, but I kind of don't want to end it without hearing from Zubin one more time. So Zubin, and I'm going to ask you to be somewhat brief because I'm already going to get in trouble. But right before we went on, I was talking to you about that Jim Thorpe thing, and what you said is that what you would say generally is we're awake now. Explain what you meant when you said we, meaning Native American peoples, are awake.
We've had prophecies, and people consider them to be sort of just superstitious things that are said. And what has happened is there's a net that has covered the earth, and that net has allowed people to communicate with each other. But they didn't say anything about fake news. Mm-hmm. That was a prophecy that the spider web would take over the earth. Mm-hmm. There was a prophecy that our elders would be born in our children, and our children would not be born with the trauma. And I started to see that out in the West, where the kids were born. They wanted to know their culture from the day they got it, the day they were born. So this is a really positive time in our history right now, in every direction, because people are awake. You're asking the right questions. We have non-native people, allies who are wanting to know what happened. And we have a voice for that now. Our voices are waking. People are now able to communicate with each other. Sarah put together somewhat, in my opinion, a sacred book. Mm-hmm.
I can see why you would say that. All right, I'm going to, first of all, I have to stop now, but I just want to thank both of you, Sarah and Zubin, and I want to promise you this is not the last episode we're going to do on this topic, not the last episode we're going to do about some of the other issues that are in Sarah's book that we don't have time to get to. Right now, unfortunately, we have to leave briefly while some very nice people come on and ask you to support the programming that we're doing right now. So if this whole thing means something to you, it would be wonderful if you could donate, if you could pledge during this little break.
And I've been thinking about our mother and how they took her away from her people, put her in a boarding school, away from her brother, sister.
You're listening to the Colin McEnroe Show here on WNPR, Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel here with my colleague Lee Newton, waiting on your call of support at 1-800-584-2788. Lee, how you doing?
I am good, Lucy. It's good to hear you. And we do hope that you will go to the phone or go online right now and support the Colin McEnroe Show. It's a signature program, of course, on Connecticut Public Radio, much like yours, Lucy, where we live. But we want to keep it supported. We want to make sure Colin is always here bringing us the bounty of his curiosity and intelligence and all the things that interest him with every show. It's such an exciting program to listen to every day. You never know what he's going to bring to the table, but we know Colin is wonderful and we want to keep him right here on Connecticut Public Radio. We can do that with your support when you go to WNPR.org, make a contribution there online. That's easy, it's safe, it's secure. Or you can call us at 1-800-584-2788.
We have a goal this hour to raise $1,000 to support our station campaign and the Colin McEnroe Show. So please do your part. And that number again is 1-800-584-2788. Lee, we know so many people listen to our programs using our live stream at WNPR.org. And when you're there, you can click on that donate link. And it's so easy to figure out how much do I want to give to my public radio station that I depend on each and every day. And then there's a great list of thank you items that we offer our listeners who become supporters. It's getting cold, and the Connecticut Public Radio socks are a great thing to select for $8 a month. We have so many great products here, whether it's the Connecticut Public Beanie or maybe you're a Fresh Air fan for a gift of $10 a month. But the important thing is that you pick up the phone or go online now to support the station. Again, it's our end of the year campaign. We can't do it without your help. And I am so proud, Lee, when we think about how even in this pandemic, we have been able to broadcast and continue to provide you quality programming each and every day because of producers, because of people like Kat Pastor, our tech producer, and so many other people behind the scenes. If you appreciate this program, now is the time to donate. 1-800-584-2788.
Yes, Lucy, that's exactly right. And, and it's not just because of, of course, it's a big part of the producers and the team there, but it's also because of members, because of individuals who have come forth this year and in years past and allowed us the financial wherewithal to continue to expand our programming here and continue to make the signature shows like the Colin McEnroe Show as strong as ever. So thank you for that. If you've given in the past, if you're ready to give for the first time or maybe give again, here's the number, 1-800-584-2788, or you can go to WNPR.org and make your contribution there. And I do want to mention that the socks that Lucy, you were just talking about, we have a limited number of those socks. We're going to be have a brand new design that's going to be coming soon. So if you want exciting. That great original Connecticut Public Radio socks, this is the time to pledge for them. Or if you'd like the black beanie hat, which is great, it's black, it's got our little P logo on it, it's one size fits most, and it's very nice and warm in this weather. That's for a gift of $10 a month. So make your contribution right now. Go to WNPR.org, support the Colin McEnroe Show. It's such an important show in our lineup, and we want to make sure that it's always here for you, 1 o'clock every weekday. So support it right now, 1-800-584-2788, or visit WNPR.org.
Both Lee and I are transplants to Connecticut. Neither one of us are natives. I've actually lost track. How long have I lived here in this great state? But one thing I do love during these fund drives, Lee, is hearing from our listeners from all over the state, people who donate time and time again. We have our monthly sustaining members. They pick an amount, and each month it comes out of their credit card supporting the station for programs like the Colin McEnroe Show. We can't do it without your support. And for those of you who have already already donated this year and are able to do so again, we thank you for your generosity. If you have yet to pick up the phone at 1-800-584-2788 or going online to WNPR.org, you have time to do so. It takes just a couple of minutes. You're going to feel great knowing that you're supporting your public radio station here at Connecticut Public Radio. The number again, 1-800-584-2788 or WNPR.org.
We are back. This is the time when I am proud and pleased to thank Kat Pastor, who's there in the studio making this whole show happen, technically and artistically, and of course to thank Betsy Kaplan, senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show and producer of this episode. I said at the outset that one of the reasons that we wanted to talk about this whole topic, and will continue to talk about this whole topic in future episodes, has to do with politics, actually, about what happened in the 2020 election, how, in fact, the Native American vote in many places coalesced and got behind candidates also of Native American origin. Here to talk to us about that is Tara Benally, who is of Hopi descent, born for Navajo, and is a field director at the Utah Rural Project. Welcome to our show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, first of all, tell us about the Utah Rural Project. What does that actually do?
So, Rural Utah Project is a nonprofit organization, a C3. What we do is back in 2018, our first thing that we wanted to do out there in southern San Juan County, Utah, was to do voter registration across the Navajo Nation there in Utah alone.
Well, actually, before I'm going to turn back to that in just a second, but there's sort of an immediate news tie into all this. You may be registering and organizing voters for yet another election in New Mexico pretty soon. It does appear as though the top choice for the Secretary of the Interior in the Biden candidate is one of the people reelected in this case to Congress, a person of Native American descent. Nancy Pelosi has also thrown in her weight behind this choice. Tell us about this member of Congress. Who is she? What's her name? And how excited are you by this idea?
I'm extremely excited. And this would be Deb Haaland. She was elected into office back in 2018. And let me tell you, that has made a world of difference for a lot of indigenous nations across the United States. It gives them an opportunity. It gave them an opportunity. It still gives them an opportunity to see that it's possible for a change if we just work together, come together, and just really put the nonprofit organizations who are helping in this effort and really work with them and make things possible this way. And so, yes, absolutely. And we're looking forward to that election for Deb Haaland to become the next Secretary of Interior.
Yeah, so we should say you've met Deb Haaland. Under New Mexico law, she would not have to resign her House seat until her confirmation is complete as Secretary of the Interior. But then there'll be another election. They'll have to set the date of a general election to fill that vacancy to occur within 77 to 91 days of the vacancy taking effect. So this is kind of where you and other people like you come in and get back to work. Talk about the difficulties of registering Native American people. There are some special thresholds that have to be scaled that maybe don't exist in other places.
Well, right now, I think a lot of it has to do with broadband, Wi-Fi, internet connections, connectivity, cell phone services. That was one of our biggest problem across Navajo Nation alone, just this past year, and even in San Juan County back in 2018. And so the door-to-door knocking has been a very great a successful way to reach out to community members. But because of COVID, we had to quit knocking on doors and come up with innovative ways to reach out to the communities. We have, our first shutdown after COVID had happened back in March of this year, we had decided to call the people that we had registered earlier on in the year and see if they could reach out to their friends and family and get information to us to see if they were registered and if they could share their contact information with us. And that way, in return, we could reach out to those community members and drop off, call ahead of time, drop off a Ziploc bag containing a voter registration form, a pin, our contact information, or our field organizers that's working within those communities, their contact information. And once the individual have filled out the voter registration forms, they would call us back and we would pick up the forms and with no contact. Well, that worked for a little while, but then the second shutdown came with COVID. And so we had to go back to the drawing board and see what we could come up with to really make it a little more successful so we could capture that much more people. By then we had a lot of people, other organizations and other entities come out and do food distribution or propane distribution or firewood distribution. And so we would ask those organizations to see if we could be a part of those distribution and do voter registration. And so we were able to capture that much more people. And after the second lockdown as well, we had also reached out to a lot of the shopping centers to see if we couldn't do drive-through voter registration, where people would drive up to our tables, get a voter registration form, or we would check their voter registration status using our text tool. And so we just come up with different innovative ways to really overcome a lot of these obstacles that we had faced. There was always the language barrier out there, making sure that people were able to drop off their ballots in time early enough for it to be received at the county recorder's office before the election. As you know, COVID had really slowed down the mail process, and then everything else that was happening with the postal service had really slowed down. So people would send off their ballots, say like beginning of the month, and the recorder wouldn't see until 2 weeks later in their office. And so we had to really encourage people to just drop off their ballots at ballot locations or drop off boxes or the polling places. And so that helped us help the people a lot. There was still a lot of confusion. There's still a lot of chaos because so many things have changed. They've implemented so many new things where because we were getting so many voter registration forms in daily at the county recorder's office, they were seeing that they could set up more drop-off box locations, polling places. And so people weren't really sure where they needed to go, what they needed to do, how they need to go about getting registered. And then with the extension of the voter registration back in October and then having it cut back again, it was that, and that made it, added to the confusion. And so there was a lot of stuff that we had to work through, but we made it work and we flipped that state blue.
That's an amazing thing. So, one of the things, in terms of, you talk about the language barrier, there's also just some making sure, being able, as you are, to honor the customs. If I were trying to register voters in the Navajo Nation, I wouldn't be very good at it because I wouldn't know how to act and what to say. One of the things that you talk about in your article is when you approach somebody or are approached somebody in one of these scenarios, you introduce your clan, I think is the phrase that you use. Give people an example of that. What would you say? What would the other person say?
So I would knock on the person's door and they would answer, and I would say, "Ya she tara banali I would state my name and I would state my clan, and it would throw a lot of people off because I introduced myself as Hopi, and so people would look at me suspiciously, and I'd be like, "Well," and they're like, "What are you doing here at my door? Why are you knocking on my door?" And I would go in and explain why I'm there, why I'm knocking on their door, and why a Hopi, somebody claiming to be Hopi, is knocking on their door. And I have a story about that. 4 or 5 generations ago, my grandmother, who was Hopi, was stolen from Hopi and brought to Navajo. Well, the lady that she was given to, she was supposed to take her on as her slave. But fortunately enough for my grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, the lady decided to raise her as her own. And so that's how we became on Navajo, came to be on Navajo. And so people are like, and out of the respect for the Navajo lady that took my grandmother in those generations ago, I'm back to help the people, to say thank you and really help make this possible, to help the people, not just on Navajo Nation, but also on Hopi as well, and with any other nations across the United States.
So, yeah, you'd even describe an encounter with a gentleman who says to you, I'm born for the red mark on my cheek, right? Which I think also corresponds to part of your clan identification. Do I have that right?
Yes, and that would make him my father, my clan father on my dad's side. And so yes, and so it's really interesting to be out there and you would think that you would out there among strangers, but once you start introducing yourselves, the other individual introduces themselves as well, and you find that you're related in some way in your clan system, because you have the maternal clan, your paternal clan, your grandmother's clan, your grandfather's clan, and then your grandfather and your grandmother on your father's side as well. And so you have wherever you're at on the nation, or even in the world, or in the United States, you come across somebody that's related to you through clan, and so you don't ever feel like you're alone out there.
All right, we have to stop there. Although there's like a million other things I wanted to ask you about, but you got to get to work. You're going to have to hold that New Mexico seat if, in fact, Deb Haaland becomes Secretary of the Interior, which sounds like a great and historic event. Tara Benali, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you again for having me.
And thank you for listening. Once again, you'll have an opportunity to pledge right here. Please do it. Please do it during our show if you care about what we do and how we do it. This is the right time to pledge. Thank you for listening. Thank you for pledging if you do.
And then she found herself a lover, 2 kids in the house. She set goals to break the cycle. She changed her whole world because she refused to be idle. Now both of her kids.
And the number to call is 1-800-584-2788 or visit WNPR.org to support the Colin McEnroe Show. I am Lee Newton. I'm here with Lucy Nalpathanchil, and we'd love to invite you to join us right now. This hour, we have a goal of $1,000 for the Colin McEnroe Show. We're working our way toward that here during our December radio campaign. You can be a part of it right now. Join us. You can give any amount that you'd like. If you'd like to give a single gift, you can do that. If you'd like to become a monthly sustainer, that's a way that a lot of people like to do it. Give a little bit each month. It feels good. It's easy on your budget, and it makes a real long-term difference for the programming that you enjoy here on Connecticut Public Radio. But do it right now. Working our way toward that $1,000 goal, 1-800-584-2788, or visit WNPR.org. Lucy.
Thank you, Lee. You know, I've been thinking about how it's been a challenging year for all of us in one way or another. And something about the Colin McEnroe Show, for many of you who listen, we know that Colin and his team bring you really interesting conversation with whether they're authors or comedians or just really interesting conversations about off-the-wall topics. But something that Colin and his team they have really done, especially on Monday during the scramble, is spending time talking to scientists and researchers about the latest in this pandemic and the latest in this journey to get a vaccine. And we are so very close. And so this is a really exciting time as we look to hopefully the next several months getting through this pandemic. But you know that you can rely on the Colin McEnroe Show to provide you with analysis and information that can help us each and every day as we work together to get through this. Again, the number to support this programming because you depend on it, 1-800-584-2788, or you can go online to WNPR.org.
And, you know, Lucy, I like to, put on my earbuds, go out for walks and listen to the Colin McEnroe Show in the middle of the day if I can get out. And, if you would like some earbuds, we have some Connecticut Public Radio wireless ones that are available to you for a gift of $15 a month. But do that right now because this is a show, and all of the programs that we have on Connecticut Public Radio are a companion for you, whether you're getting up in the morning, getting ready, cooking, exercising, whatever it may be. We are your partner. We're right there along with you, reflecting your values, your interests, as you said, our concerns and about the vaccine and what's happening. We are just as concerned as you are, and we're bringing all of that conversation to you. Please support it today. Go to 1-800-584-2788 or online at WNPR.org.